I love the project that we are going to make today. It's one of my favorites that I've ever done, and you don't need a sewing pattern for it. You're gonna make all the pieces yourself because it's really easy and straightforward. We're going to be making a tote bag, but I like to call it the Girlie Pop Tote because yeah, it's a tote bag, but it's a little bit more fun. It's a little more out of the box, and when you see it, you don't think like, oh, that's just a basic tote. It's good. I would say that this is a beginner-friendly tutorial, maybe confident beginner. If you've literally never sewn anything in your life, this might be like slightly adventurous, but you could definitely still give it a shot. If you've used a sewing machine before, you've sewn basic stuff, you would have no problem with this one. And you don't need a serger, which is great. You're going to need 2 different fabrics, or you could do it from the same fabric, but you need a main fabric and then a lining fabric for the inside. For my main fabric, I'm using this really pretty blue gingham from the fabric store. It's giving Dorothy vibes a little bit, but in like a good way. I'm very excited about this one. So it's 100% cotton. It's a 3-ounce cotton, so it's like pretty thin, pretty loosey-goosey, which while you're making your bag, if you want a sturdier bag, definitely use a heavier fabric. But for the main fabric, I wouldn't go heavier than maybe like a 6 or 7-ounce fabric, just because then there's like ties, and when you're making the ties, that part could get a little tricky if the fabric is too bulky. But at the same time, this is a 3-ounce fabric. I wouldn't want both my main and lining fabric to be this thin, because then it's gonna be like very loosey-goosey, which I don't really want. So for my lining fabric, I had some leftover 9-ounce cotton twill. This is from Blackbird, and it's just like a cream twill. For the lining, 9 ounce is gonna be totally fine. It'll give the bag a little bit of hidden structure on the inside, which I think is going to be great. So those are my fabrics: main fabric, lining fabric, and I'll show you all the pieces you need from each, but you do need about 1 yard of each fabric. One last note before we jump in, we are working with bias tape in this pattern. I've made so much bias tape that at this point it's not daunting to me at all, and I promise it's not hard, but some people see the word bias tape and get nervous. So I'm just gonna explain, if you've never used bias tape before, essentially what it is it's a strip of fabric that was cut on the bias. The bias is at a 45-degree angle of the fabric, and the reason you would want to do that is because the bias is usually stretchier than, like, the 45-degree angle has a little bit more stretch to it than just the straight across. So you can kind of see it like warps a little bit, and that's what we want. So we're gonna be using bias tape both as a facing for the bag, but also as the ties. And it's just a little bit easier to manipulate than straight across fabric as you're like pinning things in curves and folding it to make the ties. It's just a better way to cut it. So don't let that make you nervous if you don't love bias tape. We use a minimal amount of it, and it's very, very easy. Okay, I think that's it. We're gonna jump into construction, but I cannot wait for you to make this bag. It's gonna turn out so cute. We need to draft just 1 pattern piece for the bag. So start off with a rectangle 17 inches by 21 inches. You can use any sort of paper. I've just taped together a few pieces of construction paper from my kids, and then go ahead and fold that in half. Then at the top corner, you're going to measure 1.5 inches in and mark a line there. In the center, you're going to mark a line 9 inches down. Then you want to go in and connect those 2 points with a curved line. It does not have to be perfect by any means. I just go in and freehand it. If you want some sort of guide, you could use a bowl or a plate, but it really isn't that necessary to get it a perfect curve. Once that's marked, cut the curve out and you have your pattern piece. From that pattern piece, you'll need to cut 2 from your main fabric, 2 from your lining fabric, a pocket bag, a strap, 4 strips of bias tape, 2 small squares, and then a little strip of 3/8 inch wide elastic. All the measurements are there on your screen for you. One thing to note about the strap, the 30-inch length is what fits well on my body. If your body is a different size than mine, I would recommend measuring from just below your bust to your mid-back, and that should be your strap measurement. That may seem a little bit short, but trust me, it will work out perfectly. Okay, first up, we are going to grab the pocket bag that was cut from your lining fabric, and we're gonna fold the top edge down 1/4 inch, press it, fold it down 1/4 inch again, press it again, and then we're going to stitch along that folded edge. That should be just under 1/4 inch seam allowance right along the edge of the fold. Lay your pocket bag with the wrong side facing the right side of your lining and pin that in place. And then we are going to mark 2 dividing lines into this pocket bag to create 3 separate pockets. Because this bag is 17 inches wide, I mark my pockets at 6 inches, then the middle pocket is 5 inches, and then the final pocket is 6 inches again. So I would make a mark at 6 inches and 11 inches. You can see I marked the first marking with a pen because that will get sucked up into the seam allowance, and then I didn't have any chalk handy, so I just marked the rest of them with pins, and I'm going to kind of use the pins as guidelines as I'm sewing. So you can see I start at the pen marking, follow the pins up in a straight line, and then do a couple little back stitches at the top of the pocket bag. And in the end, you'll have 3 cute little divided pockets. Now find your other bag piece from your lining and lay it face down, right sides together, and pin it all the way around the edge. Then we're going to sew your linings together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, starting at the top of one corner, sewing all the way down, pivoting at the bottom, sewing along the bottom, pivoting again, and sewing up the other side. Then you'll want to trim your corners to get rid of any bulk when you turn it inside out. Next, you're going to press those 2 side seams open flat with an iron, but when you go to press the bottom seams, you're going to fold both of your bottom corners into points, lining up the bottom seam and the side seams perfectly. I like to flip my corners up and really feel in there with my fingers, making sure those side seams line up because you want them to be on perfectly, and this is what it kind of should look like once it's pinned. Once those corners are pressed and pinned, you're going to lay them on a flat surface and measure 2 inches up from the corner at a perpendicular angle and make a little marking along the edge of the corner. That is where we're going to stitch along. Once you've stitched along that line and back stitched really well, you're going to snip that entire corner off. Don't worry about finishing that seam because it will be all enclosed in the bag, but this is what your lining looks like now that it's all finished. You can see your cute little pockets in there. Now you're going to repeat that entire process minus the pocket with your main fabric, and once that's all finished, you're going to flip the main fabric inside out, but don't flip the lining inside out, because you are going to shove your lining inside of your main bag. It may take a little bit of finagling, but just keep working with it, pressing down into the corners until your lining lays nicely inside of your main bag. Once it does, you're going to pin all the way around the top edge of your bag to keep it in place. And then you're going to go in and baste stitch around that top edge as well. If you've never basted anything before, it's basically just the longest stitch length on your machine. Your basting stitch should be very close to the edge. I would say at about an 1/8 inch seam allowance, and that will just help hold everything in place without pins getting in the way. That's what your basting stitch should look like, and now we get to move on to buttonholes. I'm of course going to be walking through how my machine does buttonholes, but if your machine is very different and you've never done them before, you can look up how to do them on your machine. The first step in finding the buttonhole placement is to find the center of the bag. So find the side of the bag that does not have the pockets on the lining and fold it in half and do a little snip in the center to find that center mark. I'm marking mine with the pen as well so it's easy to see. Then from that center marking, take a ruler and measure up 3/8 of an inch, and then you want to make 2 markings 1/2 inch apart. So they'll be 1/4 inch apart from the center mark and 1/2 inch apart from each other. That should look like this. Now I'm going to take the buttonhole foot of my machine and make sure that the distance is lined up to 3/8 of an inch. Then I'll attach the buttonhole foot to my machine, make sure my settings are on the correct stitch, and then I'm going to line up the first buttonhole marking that I made right in the little window of the buttonhole foot. The process of sewing the buttonholes is super simple. My hands are pretty much just loosely holding the fabric, and I'm keeping a steady pressure on the pedal, and the machine just does the rest. Once those are all done, go in with a seam ripper and open them up, being very careful that you're not seam ripping through the buttonhole. Now we're going to move on to the strap. So fold your strap in half, right sides together, and stitch down the length at 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then you're going to take a large safety pin and pin it into the seam allowance of the strap, and then turn the head of the safety pin down into the channel of the strap and kind of push and pull and push and pull, guiding the safety pin all the way through the strap out the other end. Then you're going to press that finished strap flat, and I like to press it with the seam in the center. Set that strap aside for now, and then grab the 2 little squares that you cut. You're going to fold up the bottom edge of both squares 1/4 inch and press it. Now we're going to attach the straps to your bag. So take one end of your bag, lay it flat, grab your strap and lay it right side against the right side of the bag, and then take one of your little squares and lay the right side of that against this big sandwich situation we have going on, and pin it all together. So your strap should be sandwiched in between your square and your bag. This is what all that should look like, and then you're going to want to trim the edges of your square to kind of match up with the shape of the strap and end of your bag. Repeat that process on the other side, so now you have 2 pinned together sandwiches, and make sure that your strap is not twisted. Okay, now grab one of the bias strips that you cut and fold it in half to find the center, make a little baby notch there, and do the same thing to your bag. Fold that in half and make a notch as well. And then you're going to line up those notches and pin them together. Continue pinning that bias strip along the top edge of your bag, and it should overlap about 1/4 inch up into your sandwich area. If it goes much farther than that, it's totally fine to trim it off, but you don't want it to miss that sandwich. You do want it to overlap, I would say at least 1/2 inch. Repeat this process on the other side of the bag so that both sides should have a bias facing pinned all the way across the top edge, looking like this. I know there's a lot of pins going on at the moment, but no worries, we're gonna get rid of them right now. So starting at one end of the bag, stitch along the top edge at 1/4 inch seam allowance. And what you wanna do is have a continuous stitch starting from that one end, going all the way across one edge, up through the other end, continuing across the strap and down through the other end, finishing where you started. This is what the ends of your bag should look like, but I will note, I want my stitch to run right along the edge of where the strap comes in, which you can kind of see, I can feel with like my thumbs there. It didn't quite hit where I wanted it to, so I just went back in with another stitch and sidled up against that strap. You're going to want to trim up your corners with some scissors so that when we turn it inside out, it's not quite as bulky. Once you've done that, grab your strap, give it a little tug, and that will pull the ends of your bag inside out, or right side out in this case. You may want to go in here with something pointy. I just used my closed scissors and poke those corners through a little bit so they're not quite so lumpy and they're a little more sharp. Then you're going to want to take your iron and press those ends nice and flat. Now we're going to fold that bias facing over twice. First, we're going to fold it over 1/4 inch and press it down. And this can get a little bit tricky when you go up toward your sandwich area, but just go slow, kind of push everything else out of the way and get that fold in place. And then you can go back later and kind of even everything out with the iron, so don't worry too much about squishing up your sandwich. Once you've folded your facing 1/4 inch, you're going to fold it again at the seam. So essentially from the front side of the bag, you won't be able to see the bias facing at all. Once you've double folded your facing on both sides of the bag and really gone in there with the iron, pressed it down nice and flat, you're going to want to pin that in place. And yes, when I was originally putting my pins in, I did the pins facing out. Rookie mistake, I would definitely recommend them pointing in. Otherwise, you're gonna stab yourself repeatedly. Now we're going to make 2 little dots up inside your sandwich, and this is going to mark where you want your stitch to start and end along the bias facing. Because you'll be a little bit blind going up in there, you won't quite be sure when you've gone far enough into the sandwich, so this will kind of help guide you. Those 2 little dots should be about 3/8 of an inch up into your sandwich area. Okay, we are going to edge stitch along the bias binding on one side of your bag. So start at one of the dots that you just made, slide that under your presser foot, start there, and then go all the way along that top edge of your bag, stitching pretty close to the edge of the bias binding. When you get to the other end of your bag, slow down a little bit, lift your little sandwich flap up, find the mark that you marked, and end your stitch there. So this is what the finished product should look like. Repeat that process on the other side, and one thing to keep an eye on is to make sure that you don't stitch over your buttonholes. Now we are going to make the ties. So take the 2 remaining strips of bias tape that you cut earlier, and we're going to start off by folding them first in half, or just folding them like traditional bias tape. So if you've never done that before, start by folding it in half. Then take the bottom edge and fold it up toward the center, and then the top edge and fold it down toward the center. So essentially you folded it in 4 quarters with the raw edge sealed within the center of the bias tape. This is what that should look like, all folded and pressed, and then we're going to stitch along the entire edge of those ties. Once that's all stitched up beautifully, we are going to slide it inside of our bag. So attach a small safety pin to one end, and then lift up your elusive sandwich flap once again, and slide that safety pin down into the channel. And make sure this is on the side of the bag that has the buttonhole openings. So push that safety pin through, push, pull all the way through until it comes out one side of the buttonhole. Gently pull that tie through until the end of the tie lines up with the end of the bias binding. Be very careful so that the tie doesn't get sucked into the channel, otherwise you'll have to start over, and then pin that in place. Repeat this process with the other tie, and then I just finish my ties off by tying the end of them. We are so close to being done, you guys. We pretty much just need to put the elastic in. So very similar process to the ties. You're gonna slide the elastic in with the safety pin attached to one end. kind of push, pull again, and really be sure with the elastic that it doesn't get sucked into the channels. So once you're kind of nearing the end of that elastic matching up to the end of the bias binding, pin that in place. I double pin my elastic just to make sure it doesn't slip out, and then continue to pull the elastic through the other side and pin that in place as well. So once we have our ties and our elastic all pinned in place, we are going to go ahead and top stitch around our little sandwich area. We want to top stitch pretty close to the edge. I would say at about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, although on the bottom edge I go a little bit further up, maybe 1/4 inch seam allowance. This is what the top stitching should look like when it's all done, and at this point your bag is finished. I did add a little something extra to my bag because I had this cute tag that I got from Blackbird Fabrics, and I felt like the bag could use just something a little extra on the outside. So I pinned that tag to the bottom right hand corner and top stitched around the edge of it. And I think it's cute. I really like how it turned out. All that's left to do now is tie those front ties off into a bow. And that is it. Now your bag is all finished, and I am obsessed with this gingham fabric. It turned out so cute, and I love the inside lining. It's a 9-ounce cotton twill on the inside, so definitely a pretty thick lining, but I love that it gives it, like, it has a really solid structure. Like, I feel like it gives it a really good shape. Yeah, it's so cute. Wait, I love it. Yep, this is the bag. So you can see the straps, like we talked about, the straps like end here, but then the bag kind of has like part of the strap in it. So it should sit about, like, I feel like this is a comfortable distance to like reach into the bag. I can touch the bottom, I can reach into all the pockets and everything. There's tons of space in there, but it's like sneaky little and cute. If you end up making one and you post about it on Instagram, TikTok, whatever, tag me, because I love seeing when people make things from my tutorials. So I would love to see that. And I'll link the fabrics that I used, and I'll link like all my go-to sewing supplies as well. I feel like I have a lot of favorite tools. So check that out as well, and let me know what we should make next. I love when people send me pictures of things that they found like on Pinterest or wherever and want me to like deconstruct and recreate it. So send me inspo of what projects we should make next. Okay, I love it. It's so cute.